I would say at first it was uncomfortable, but I didn't feel unsafe. And then they got arrested, and then a new encampment popped up, and then I felt unsafe. This is when I had people saying Zionists are not welcome here. You also had rules put in place of people weren't allowed to talk to Zionists. You weren't allowed to talk to people who weren't in the encampment. So if you wanted to have a conversation of what do you think Intifada is, like what does that mean to you? And do you understand how that makes Jewish students feel unsafe? Do you understand how, by any means necessary, feels scary and feels unsafe as proud Jews, proud Zionists on campus? You didn't get to have those conversations.
Every day, we are blessed to interact with some of Colorado's most interesting people. On this podcast, Judaism with Altitude, we share their fascinating stories with you, and
we have a great time.
And welcome back to episode 3 of Judaism with Altitude. It is great to have you with us. We are really learning on the fly here. Welcome to our home studio. And we are very, very special program today for you. And before we begin, we do request kindly that you go ahead and subscribe to this podcast on your, whatever you're listening from, whatever platform you're listening from. We'd love to have your support as we continue to build out Judaism with Altitude.
Thank you. Amazing. We are here today with Teah. Teah grew up in Greenwood Village, Colorado, and is now back in Greenwood Village after a 4-year stint at Columbia University, where she just graduated as a senior in economics.
Mazel tov. Mazel tov.
Thank you.
And we are here to hear about her experiences during this tumultuous time and year that she's been through there.
That's a great word, tumultuous. Well done. Yeah, I'm very impressed.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. We're happy to have you here. So tell us, what was campus life like as a Jew before October 7th versus after?
Yeah, I would say before October 7th, I was never consciously thinking, I'm a Jew, how is this going to affect my ability to be a part of this community? And I would say that radically changed after October 7th, and in several aspects, whether that's participating in clubs and groups on campus or even in the classroom, and also just the ability to make friends, I think became more difficult after October 7th, because someone would say, oh, are you a Zionist? If you are, I don't want to talk to you. I want nothing to do with you. I refuse to acknowledge you. And so, yeah, that definitely had a huge impact on what life was like on campus.
So interesting. So I would love to, I heard 3 things you say there, and I want more information, more details on each of them. So the first you said is that this manifested itself in the classroom, as well as in clubs. And then obviously you started elaborating about like with peers and friends. I'd like to maybe dissect that one by one. Would you mind just sharing what that means, that this manifested itself even in the classroom?
Yeah, I think one big thing in the classroom, feeling like you can participate and share your thoughts, ask questions, which is really the key to learning, requires you to feel safe in your classroom. And kind of what I was saying earlier, there was, I think, this very pervasive attitude of, if you are a Zionist, you are a white supremacist, you are been called a Nazi, and you have no regard for human life. And so when your whole identity has been distilled into, I think, a very like hateful identity, and you know that's not you, I think there is this psychological barrier of fear being in the classroom, feeling like you can't participate, feeling like if I respond to this student, are they going to see me as their like classmate, as their peer, or is this going to be an opportunity for them to try and like isolate you in the classroom or how you think? And so in the classroom, I think that was one of the biggest challenges. And then in terms of groups, that was extremely difficult. So there were two groups that kind of led pro-Palestinian rallies and initiatives. So SJP, which is Students for Justice in Palestine, and Jewish Voice for Peace. And they started initiatives that contained language like, we support Palestinian resistance by any means necessary, and had no room for empathy of what Jewish students were going through. And they got a lot of different student groups to sign on, even if it had nothing to do with politics.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. Does any means necessary that implies the methods used on October 7th, rape, murder, butchery, massacre, hostages, any means necessary?
By any means.
This is a group on campus funded by campus, like they get funding.
Yeah, so they actually got suspended for, a lot of people say it was for the university trying to censor them, and they tried to make it seem like it was a free speech issue. But in reality, the reason why they were suspended was because they were holding unauthorized events. And to clarify, the university has all groups meeting the same standard of, you need to have a certain date that is pre-planned. And the reason for that is security and making sure that students are still able to go to classes and engage in the campus community in a meaningful way, and without, having to go around these huge disruptions. So the university holds all these groups the same standard, and SJP had multiple times where they were holding rallies, protests, where the university said, you can't do it on this date, you can't do it here, because citing security reasons. And then after that, they created the narrative. They're trying to censor us. They're so pro-Israel that they're trying to silence us, which was
really is a technicality.
Yeah, exactly.
They had every right to spit the venomous hate that they wanted to, but because of this technicality, they were suspended.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like, something that felt really frustrating is, so there's also a group, Students Supporting Israel, who also had events that had to be moved. The university said, you can't hold this event on this day right here. And SSI was like, okay, we'll hold it at a later date. So because they weren't suspended, a lot of people saw it, and obviously that's a very enticing thing to say, oh, it's a free speech issue. It's because our school is Zionist and pro-Israel and trying to silence any student that goes against them, when in reality, Students Supporting Israel went through the same process, had events not be approved on the days that we wanted to. So, yeah. But to go back to your question of the groups, we had all these different groups that had nothing to do with, or never had an interest in, Israel and Palestine going forward and saying, we support this cause, signing on to a letter that came out October 8th, so the day after, a statement of solidarity, and it was co-authored by SJP and JVP. And
JVP.
Jewish Voice for Peace.
Okay. And what was in that letter?
So they condemned emails supporting those affected by the violence and loss of life in Israel. That's a quote.
Whoa. I'm sorry. I thought I heard it all. Throughout this whole situation, you think you've seen it all, and then you see something else. How Israel is currently being condemned for saving its hostages. You think you've seen it all, and then you see that. Hold on. So
can you repeat that line?
Yeah. And then I want to just make sure I understand that, but repeat it, please.
So one of the deans sent out an email that was extending support to those affected by the violence and loss of life in Israel. And SJP and JVP, in response, sent out on October 8th the statement of solidarity, which condemned those emails.
Okay, so to those who had friends, family members affected by the massacre that occurred, the dean very sensitively sent out an email of condolences for that and for the Jewish community. I know we were all in a fog on October 8th. Like everyone I spoke to everywhere couldn't function as a Jewish people as we endured the worst massacre since the Holocaust. And so the dean sensitively sent out words of support to our community. And then the Jewish Voices for Peace, as well as the
Students for Justice,
for Palestine, had a problem with his support for the grieving Jewish community. I understood that correctly? I just want to make sure.
Yep.
Okay.
And then they sent it around to student groups, alumni, students who were signing it.
Co-signing the letter against the support to the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. And there were other things in that too. In that same statement, they supported the Palestinian resistance, and they also called for the end of they wanted the end of investment in Israeli companies. We have a dual degree program with Tel Aviv University. They also called for the end of that and the closure of the Global Center in Tel Aviv.
And this is, if I'm not mistaken, before any real response, before any invasion of Gaza, any military response. This is literally while Israel was still trying to get the terrorists out of its borders.
Mm-hmm. There's a big Israeli community at Columbia. They have the School of General Studies, which allows students who've taken time off from high school to apply for an undergrad. And because a lot of Israelis spend 3 years in the IDF, they go to the School of General Studies after they've completed their time. And then, so there's a big Israeli community, extremely close, and huge groups came together on October 7th, and it was just so devastating and so painful. And there was not a minute to process, to grieve. It was immediately like any empathy was unfair. And I think that was honestly that response, and so many students signing on immediately after this like tragic, devastating loss in Israel, was the first move of dehumanizing Jews and Israelis. And I think that allowed for more groups to step in and be more blatantly anti-Semitic, because if you're seeing someone who's just absolutely devastated, grieving, in pain, mourning, scared, like we didn't know if certain people were alive or what was happening. And if you're in such a low point and someone can say to you, that was justified, and you don't get to feel sad. And if anyone feels any empathy for you, that is wrong, that is morally reprehensible, then I think that sets the stage for anti-Semitism and not seeing Jews and Israelis as like human.
What was it like on October 7th, or when you were hearing the news about it, with that large Israeli community there? Like, what was that like for you?
So on October 6th, really late at night, I was actually with some Israelis, and I remember we were just hanging out, and the first news that came in was through WhatsApp. It was from friends.
So the Israelis had friends who are WhatsApping them. What's going on?
Yeah. I have several friends that lost someone at the Nova Music Festival. Israeli news started coming in, and we saw this headline that said there were 4 hostages taken. At this point, it was 4, and everyone was like devastated. And it's kind of surreal to now think back at that moment of when it was just 4. And then there were calls from other Israelis in New York. One of our friends who had graduated the year before, he was living downtown at NYU, was like, I need to come up. We all just need to be together. And everyone stayed up that entire night and the entire day. The TV was on. Everyone was on their phone trying to reach friends, family. And I remember no one ate anything. The lights were just off, and like there weren't words. You were just watching everything unfold, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And you had like it was so unprecedented, and you were like, "This is horrible," and it kept on getting worse. I remember sitting in a room with a bunch of people, just scared.
Wow. And I'm just thinking the contrast you had as a college student at Columbia to what we had as community members in Denver, where people would stop us on the street and support us. I coached my kids' baseball team, and some mom from the other team comes and gives me a hug. She's my yarmulke, like, we're with you, we're thinking of you. And that seems not like your experience, because immediately after that letter comes out, and it opens up a can of opens up everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I would not say there was a warm embrace from the community. I think that like the immediate response was people were seeing this letter and saying like, you're taking it out of context, this is justified, this is good. We had a professor describing the events of October 7th as awesome. And
this was in class?
He wrote a blog post online right after saying this was awesome, praising it.
Is a professor in like the political realm of teaching?
Yeah, so he's a tenured professor in Middle Eastern studies.
I just have to ask, we're talking about professors. I'm a huge fan of Shai Davidi. Do you know him? Were you at any of those rallies where he spoke? I'm a big fan of his.
Yeah, he was honestly amazing. One of like the strongest advocates, and he would come to Shabbat dinners with students. He was one of the professors who was really vocal about as students are grieving, need support, and calling out anti-Semitism. But yeah.
Did you see any support? Like, is it that there was, the Jews who were grieving, and then those who were setting up encampments, and then there was like a middle section of people?
Yeah, I think there were definitely professors who went on business as usual, like nothing had happened. At first I found that really frustrating. Like, how could you pretend like nothing's happening? I will say though, as the months went on, I became really grateful for those professors, because I think I had a lot of professors who flash forward, kind of moving forward in like months, there was an encampment at Columbia, and there were professors who wanted to cancel class so that people could go be in the encampment. Professors who wanted to hold class at the encampment.
What does that mean for any of the Jewish students in the class? Like, would they even let you in? Like,
yeah. So first of all, no. It's funny because like somehow they know all the Zionists, and yeah, they're like, you're not welcome here. I think they had to change it because they had one of their leaders of the encampment had a video that said, Zionists do not deserve to live. You're lucky that I'm not going out there and murdering Zionists. And the same person wouldn't let Zionists in the encampment.
Was this a student?
This was a student. Yeah.
I remember reading about this. Yeah.
Yeah. And the response to after this video surfaced, honestly, we were all like, this is not real. You have to just kind of laugh, because the response wasn't necessarily like, oh, that was really bad. It was like, we value our members and like allow for people to unlearn things, just like Zionists have unlearned Zionism. And we were like, okay.
So the idea was that he would unlearn his murderous intentions to kill Zionists, but give him a chance, because he could, just like Zionists unlearn their Zionism, as if it's the same. Someone who would like to murder Zionists could unlearn that desire to murder people.
It's a dangerous parallel, right? Like to say, we'll give you a chance to not want to murder people. That is a moral equivalency to Zionist unlearning Zionism.
Right. Let a person who believes that the Jewish people have a right to a state should unlearn that. And that's the same as unlearning a desire to murder people.
Because they think, right, I'm just spelling this out for myself. They think that Zionists want to murder people.
Mhm.
So if this person also wants to murder people, then like
They're
it's
the
the
same.
same,
It's the same.
just on different sides.
Yeah.
Wow. Were you outwardly Jewish on campus? Like, were you actively Jewish on campus before all this started?
Yeah, so I would say I would go to Shabbat dinners at Chabad. And I would say that was, I guess, like most of my involvement. I would go to events that are like Hillel would post. So trivia nights, like just like fun events for the Jewish community. I would go to those. But I think I got a lot more involved after October 7th. Yeah.
Can you walk us through that thought process of how October 7th changed that level of involvement for you?
So I think there were a lot of clubs and organizations that, I mean, for one, would sign on to these letters that reading as a Jewish student felt devastating, dehumanizing.
Can you give an example of like, were you involved in any specific ones of those?
So there's one that I wasn't involved with. I think this is like one of the examples of how it was scary to be or to join clubs that you were interested in. But I know this was like very widely publicized, but there was a president of a club called Lion Les, who wrote this email that said the Holocaust wasn't that special and that Zionists aren't welcome and F Israel. And that, like, you have to wonder, okay, how does that have to do with Israel Palestine, of a club about it was lesbians in film, or like the intersection between lesbians and film. And it was like one of those moments of just, how could you say that? And how could you get away with saying that? How are there no consequences for saying Zionists not welcome? Creating spaces and like barring Zionists, which is most Jews, from those spaces. I think there was also this attitude, just because a club didn't get like publicized for sending out something that was overtly Zionist not welcome or F Israel or anti-Semitic, it became so normalized to have those sentiments and to be vocal about it that members of clubs would feel very comfortable like not letting you participate. And I think there are a lot of covert ways that you can do that. Like if someone's in a room and you completely ignore them, pretend like they're not there, yeah, of course you're not going to go back. And it didn't take an email or something in writing to say you're not welcome. But also there wasn't anyone calling that out. I know there was one of my friends was in a fashion magazine and she just edited videos. And they knew she was Jewish, Zionist, and so other people in that club would edit her videos before being posted and throw in at the end, Free Palestine, and then put her name at the end as a way to antagonize her. They knew that she was, at that point, I think like one of very few Jews in that club that decided to stay. Other people got kind of pushed out of their clubs I had a friend who got pushed out for just suggesting that since they were doing a fundraiser for Gaza, that they should do a fundraiser for Israel too. So it's like all these little things of pushing people out of these spaces that created this feeling of, I am not welcome unless I'm with like other Jews. And so I think the Jewish clubs supported Jews in so many ways and did a fantastic job. And I think it was just a space where people, one, felt safe, like physically and mentally safe, but also, especially the weeks, months after October 7th, where you could grieve and not be demonized and called a Nazi for mourning a loss.
Were there ever moments where you felt physically unsafe while on campus?
I don't know. So there were times where I chose not to go to campus. I chose not to go to class because there were a lot of times when there were protesters. It would bring in people from like all over New York. They weren't necessarily students who were violent. I would say the second semester it became more intense, more violent. There were flare guns outside of our gates. There were people who would throw rocks and like harass you.
Would they do it to just anyone like walking by who wasn't part of them, or they somehow particularly targeted Jewish students?
I think it was definitely targeted towards Jewish students and any student who had, like, if you had an Israeli flag or were wearing a student supporting Israel sweatshirt, or if you're wearing a kippah, all of those things like would kind of indicate that you're either Zionist or Jew and therefore Zionist. But then they would say, "Oh, we're not anti-Semitic; we're just anti-Zionist." And you're like, okay,
The greatest fallacy.
yeah.
So you sought refuge in the Jewish clubs and things going on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that across the board? Did attendance change? Did the Jewish, like, what was that like? Is the Jewish scene and coming together?
I think it was, honestly, it was really special, like the way the Jewish community came together. I think Shabbat dinners played a huge part in just being able to come together to support one another, especially in the early days. Because we also had friends who then went back to Israel, and then you're like, okay, I'm not going to hear from you for a while. I don't know if you're alive. I don't know if you're okay, and you just have to keep going. And at the same time, you can't really express to other people like, I'm going through this really hard time because my friend is in the IDF, because then the response is you support the IDF, or they call it the IOF.
What does that stand for?
I've heard two different things. So it's Israel Occupation Force and Israel Offensive Force.
Okay.
Yeah. There was few spaces where you can just like feel like you could breathe, and I think after that, we were always just on the defensive of, okay, I'd love to have this conversation with you if you're willing to sit down and not just call me a Nazi and walk away. Like, I would love to engage in a conversation. And so there was so much commitment to learning, not just learning about Israel and the history of Israel, but I would say just like Jewish literacy in general. I think there were so many conflicting feelings, like when you in your heart have so much love for a place, and then you have friends that you've known for your whole time in college, or professors then tell you that's wrong. There was a little bit, I think all of us kind of experienced at points, am I wrong? Like, am I a bad person? Did I get this wrong? And so there was a huge commitment to learning. And I don't know anyone personally who was like, I learned more and then decided I was wrong, which was like great. But I think there was this huge commitment to learning and engaging and just having community. I think people were so proud to be Jewish, which would seem really counterintuitive because of how bad everyone's reaction was. But I know people who started wearing a kippah to support their friends who, like, if they didn't wear a kippah usually, they would do it to support their friends and banding together. People would wear their Magen David. They were proud. We had a campaign for all Jewish students to have a mezuzah. And again, people were proud. And
just a blatant expression of your Jewishness right where you live.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah.
Was that scary, taking that on?
And were there any incidences of vandalism because of that you're aware
of? I think there was an instance of someone's mezuzah being taken down. I didn't feel scared. I lived off campus, and I actually had a lot of friends who would come to my apartment and just stay.
Because they
And
felt unsafe on campus and they wanted to get
yeah,
off.
or just like being able to breathe.
A safe space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My roommate and I tried to do dinners of just Jewish joy with girls that were all years. So we had some freshmen, sophomores who would come, and sometimes when they just needed a break, sleep over at our apartment. But I feel like the way the Jewish community really showed up for each other was super special. And I think that is like the entire range of people who didn't grow up like very observant to, or like just culturally Jewish, only celebrated like holidays, to people who were modern Orthodox. Like everyone just came together, and that was beautiful.
Wow. I'm curious because I saw just a lot on social media about the quote unquote token Jew who was in the encampments leading. Suddenly now they're wearing a yarmulke and they're tallis leading a service as if they always do that. So you mentioned before that you had friends who naturally were like, well, am I crazy? Like, is there something wrong with me? And then you all concluded, no, like I'm not. Did you know any of these? Was that a big phenomenon of like Jews on the other side in the encampment uh, proclaiming to speak for the Jewish people, and then people will come back to you and say, "Well, look at all these Jews in the encampment. What's wrong with you? How could you be so insensitive?" Did you have any of that, or is that a little bit overplayed on the media? The media loves that, and I'm just curious, like, what it's like on the ground.
Yeah, the amount of Jews in JVP is very small. There's a lot of people who aren't Jewish who are in JVP.
I have a question. I'm curious. You alluded to this a little bit, but I'm curious more specifically about the trajectory from October 7th and that intense aftermath, that binding together, how life began to carry on campus, and then ultimately get worse as you got closer to graduation with the encampments.
Yeah.
And I'm curious that experience of the encampments and walking past there and your feelings. And I'm just curious, like, I mean, it was what, I guess 7, 8 months, or maybe, I don't know, 6 months, 7 months from when October 7th happened until you graduated. And I'm curious kind of that journey and what
Yeah.
that looked like.
So, like I said, right after, it was really hard because there were such intense feelings of grief, mourning, devastation, fear, concern for the hostages. And you didn't get to really, you didn't have the space to mourn. You didn't like immediately, there was not like a lot of empathy of, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm so sorry that you lost someone. And it was, oh, that was justified. That is their fault. Especially like the rapes, people saying that was justified, or denying that it happened at all. Like, oh, of propaganda from Israel, of course they're going to say that.
And did you guys ask your fellow liberal-minded college students why, in general, like it would appear that any decent human would be against violating women, and there's been different movements over the years in support of women, Me Too, uh, all kinds of movements on campuses in support of marginalized groups. People have had it rough. Was there any clapping back and asking, like, why is it different now? Like, why are you silent? Why? I'm curious. Yeah.
No, that question was definitely asked often. Never received an answer. I think the usual response was, that's propaganda. And for you to spread that propaganda is not feminist and you're part of the problem. Or there was just like, I think one thing that was so hard is there wasn't really discussion. There, like, it was so rare to have someone who was anti-Israel actually hear what you had to say. The response was, you're a Zionist, I have nothing to say to you. there was never that interaction of let's talk about this, like let's have a difficult conversation, and like I'll hear you out and then you hear me out. It was again from the get-go that dehumanization, I think, of you're morally not allowed to care about Israel, and if you do, you're somehow subhuman. You don't get to have a conversation. I'm not going to hear you out. So yeah, those questions were definitely asked. Very rare was it answered.
Did you have any friends personally who either like totally let go of the friendship or dehumanized you, or maybe were able to have a conversation with you?
Yeah, I think by graduation, I had 3 non-Jewish friends, and before, I would say like 50% of my friends were Jewish, 50 not Jewish. And I remember at first I was like, okay, I'm willing to have these conversations. I want to have these conversations, and they would just lead nowhere. I remember, of course, social media plays a huge part in this. Of someone would post something about how October 7th is Israel's fault. Like, again, the sentiment of by any means necessary, it's justified. And I remember responding saying, how could you say this is justified? Like, how could you say some innocent person was killed and it was their fault? And like the response was, you're missing the context. Like, and for me, that's so frustrating. It's such like a cop out of you're missing the context. And they say, okay, well, what context? Let's talk about it. Like, and then they go 75 years of apartheid, and you're like, tell me what that means. Tell me what that means. Be specific. And then it's like, obviously, I can't have a conversation with you. And you're like, okay, well, I can't have a conversation with someone who refuses to talk to me. And then, yeah, classmates too, who know you're Zionist, just don't want to sit by you in class anymore.
Wow.
It's like things like that. So I think
it's like stuff you hear about from like the 30s, the 1930s, like just Jews being dehumanized, ostracized, pushed away.
Yeah. I will say there were a few friends who at the beginning didn't really know what was happening, and they were scared to say the wrong thing, so they said nothing. And one thing that I really loved is my roommate and I were like, why don't we invite some of our non-Jewish friends to Shabbat so that they see who we are. They see us as more than like Zionists, but they see our humanity and see like our love and how special Judaism is. And I had friends who were super open to that, and they came, and that was something really special. And it wasn't necessarily a direct conversation of let's talk about October 7th, let's talk about Israel Palestine. And it was more like, let me show you how beautiful this community is, and let me welcome you in so that you can like see this humanity and just what a special community is. And I think the friends who were open to that, like, so much respect for their willingness to like step into those spaces. Because I mean, I had a friend who all of her friends were in SJP, and she would still come to Jewish events and listen to what we had to say, and was so supportive, even though it meant that her other friendships were like kind of jeopardized, I'd say, because of it. So I did have a few friends who were like awesome, but at the beginning, I think it was just so hard. They didn't know what to say, so that resulted in saying nothing until we initiated that engagement. But,
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That friend who was with the SJP friend, right? Yeah, SJP friends, and who came. You said that her friendships, her other ones were jeopardized, but like, what happened with? Was she still able to do both, or it didn't work out?
I think sometimes she felt like she had to choose. Which is like, you never want to put your friend in a situation. It feels like very middle school of choose us or them. But I will say Another thing that I really, really love about the Jewish community in Colombia is like everyone was so committed to learning and had such empathy and love that a lot of people would still say, I am devastated by the destruction in Gaza and it pains me and I see where you're coming from and I see your pain. All I ask is that you see my pain too. Um, so I think it was like one of those things where if she wanted to go and be with those friends, we weren't like, you're a terrible person, you don't care about me, you're dead to me. Like there was a lot of, I don't know, like compassion, which is something that was so hard. And like there was so much emotion and so much like to carry, and then to also still have room for like the pain of Palestinians and how our friends like deeply cared about human rights and social justice. But yeah, I think it was just a moment of have some compassion for us too, like see our pain.
It's the least you can ask for.
Yeah.
Everything else going on.
Yeah.
Wow.
But that was like the beginning. And then I feel like there was a moment towards like November and December where we all just became so desensitized of like the mindset is you wake up and you just get through the day. Like the mindset was literally get through the day. And just over and over, just get through the day, get through the day. It wasn't like, I love learning. This is awesome. I'm so like happy to be here, which is crazy because so many of us worked so hard and like we're so excited to be at Columbia. It's
Your
such
seniors,
a
this
privilege.
is like kind of
Yeah,
the joyful time in your
exactly.
college
It's an
career.
amazing like academic institution. There's so many opportunities and we're so privileged to have access to this university. And then it just became get through the day and like just go to class, get through class, do your assignment, wake up, repeat.
And in class, probably dealing with all kinds of aggressions, microaggressions, and
Oh, for
but
sure.
get through that somehow. Just then repeat. Just get
Yeah,
through it.
exactly. It was always kind of like you're waiting on the edge of your seat if someone's gonna say something, or like if today's the day something's gonna happen that I can't return to this class, or I won't feel like I can come back.
Did that ever happen to you?
Um, so once I had a professor who was known um, for being anti-Semitic. He was a tenured professor, and there were reports on him about anti-Semitic comments. But again, he's tenured, so he's still there. And I remember the week after October 7th, he played videos of like people just being massacred. And then videos of Nazis. And I felt my like whole body tense. And I like at first I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not breathing. Like I can't, this is crazy. And then I was just weeping. And the reason why is because he would say this all the time. He would have like small typos in his slides. And every class would be like, yeah, ignore it. There's a typo, but it's because I create my slides every day so it's relevant. I am checking these slides every single day so the content is relevant. And I was like, how could you show these videos and Nazis and think that that's a safe space right after October 7th of like the emotion of just, it was still so raw. Um, and so again, like I said, I was with all these Israelis on October 6th, October 7th. And it was getting some stuff from news, but also some stuff from WhatsApp. And that included horrifying videos. And it brought up this just like fear of, okay, you say you create your slides every day and this is what you choose to show, like fully knowing like what's going on.
What was the context of him showing those slides? It was like a unit on war. Like what was?
I don't remember. The class was called Game of Thrones.
Hmm.
So it covered empires. Um, and so, like, I guess it was kind of related, but what he chose to show and how graphic, like, there was never any content that we were watching, like, in class like that. And I remember thinking, how is this related? Like, how is this relevant? Why is this being shown? Um, and a lot of Jewish students didn't come back to that class. And part of our grade was attendance. And I was like, I'm not going to let you take this from me. Like, I worked really hard in this class. Like, I'm going to keep showing up and, like, be proud of being Jewish and not let you take my education from me that I worked so hard to, like, get. But that was, like, I guess the only, like, that was like an extremely difficult class and extremely emotional. And I remember, like, leaving and calling my roommate and just horrified.
I have so many questions on that. You too?
I too, but I'm curious, and I want to. I am curious. I know you mentioned before about the anti-Semitism as a topic studied in class with Wagner, and I'd be curious to hear more about that. If you want to ask.
I guess I just talking to you, like I'm trying to just like kind of like picture it and understand. The videos he was showing were of the massacre on the 7th?
Not on the 7th.
They were in Gaza.
It was completely unrelated, but it was like this very graphic massacre from a movie. And the class was in a massive cinema. So the lights are off, it's on a huge screen, and
Trauma.
This like very cold auditorium, and you're just watching like a massacre unfolding, and then you're watching a clip of Nazis, and you're like, I'm confused.
Like, how did he like directly relate the two, or just left it?
I wonder if I still have the slides. That's something I'd love to go back. I remember it felt like a curveball. Like, we were doing slides, talking about Game of Thrones, and then random movie clips that were like long and extremely graphic. And I remember just like, I don't understand the connection. Like, I don't remember thinking, I don't understand. And then I was sitting there weeping. And then I was thinking, okay, I don't want anyone to know I'm crying. So I was like holding my breath. I didn't want to make any noise. And I was really scared of my professor seeing me crying. I don't know if that was like completely rational. It was definitely like just like a very visceral response of, I'm horrified. I feel so alone in this class. And then I was also scared that my professor would see my reaction and like then not see me as a student, make assumptions about me, treat me differently. But it was hard. And it was also hard knowing his background of like, he had multiple, like petitions to get him fired because of anti-Semitic remarks. I had a friend who took him before, and he's Israeli, and said he felt like he was treated different. And so, I don't know, again, like such an emotional time, but it was hard to not feel like there was a message in there, or there was an indirect way of saying something or glorifying violence. So.
Wow. It also shows like the tendency to just put professors on a pedestal, right? That like, that he's like this, and you have the sense that what he did is wrong. And at the same time, like, even with that rational knowledge, that's the environment. Is the professors, you want them to all think the best of you.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that was like one tough one. You asked about Wagner.
Right.
So I was in music humanities, which is a required class for all Columbia undergraduates, and it just goes through the history of music and important posts, how like whatever time they were growing up in contributed to their work and how listeners responded, and it just kind of traces music through history. And I had a great professor who taught it from an ethnomusicology perspective. So it's looking at what helped this become so successful and why are they part of the canon and how does that reveal something about this time in history. And she would incorporate ideas around racism. So specifically when we were talking about Joseph Bologne, and how his success is like even greater because there was so much racism, there's so many barriers, and talking about why aren't there more musicians of color in our canon, and that's because of racism. And then the same with Clara Schumann. We talked about sexism and how sexism in society like influenced how successful a composer was, but also how an audience might respond to a female musician or composer. And then all of these texts were required. So we were required to read about the effects of racism, how that affected music, both like who was creating music, who was able to listen to music, same thing with sexism. And then when it came to anti-Semitism, we were studying Richard Wagner, who was a composer in the 1800s in Germany. And my professor assigned homework about him. It was like a discussion post of, he's very anti-Semitic, should we study him? And she had like an option of, if you want to hear why he's anti-Semitic, you could do that. You don't have to, it was like completely optional, because it's too difficult to read. It's too hard to engage with. It's like, it's so anti-Semitic that you don't have to read it. And it was also assigned right before spring break. So of course, if it's going to be optional and assigned before spring break, like no one's going to read it. And then at the same time, she was expecting students to come with a discussion about whether he should be included in the canon or not. But then in the discussion, people were saying, oh, well, you have to separate the art from the artist, and just because he was anti-Semitic, it's not that big of a deal, and we shouldn't, we shouldn't put anti-Semitism on a pedestal, because by doing that, you are implying that racism, sexism, they aren't as important. And I was kind of shocked by that response, because it's like, they can all just be bad, like we could just say they're all bad. But I was really disappointed because Richard Wagner was not just anti-Semitic. His music, his writings were used as a vehicle for German nationalism and had a huge impact on people's view of Jews being morally incapable of engaging with music, of being musicians. And I think when you start like creating this idea of, music's like a universal language, and it's okay, Jews can't participate in that because they're deficient. And the fact that that wasn't brought into the conversation, that wasn't even studied, I felt like was horrible, because we were studying how sexism and racism shaped music. And here we have someone who was such an active, huge role in shaping anti-Semitism in Germany in the 1800s. And you didn't have to engage with that, but then you got to give your opinion of, oh, well, it's not that bad. And it's like, how could you, what are you even talking about? What's not that bad? Like, you wouldn't even know because you didn't engage with that. And I told my professor, I shared a little bit in class saying, I don't think in this instance you can separate musician from their music when it's a vehicle for anti-Semitism. Like, I don't think that's possible. I think it would be incoherent. And then I told my professor, and I could see where she was coming from, in terms of like trying to be thoughtful of, oh, anti-Semitism, it's so offensive that we shouldn't engage with it. She thought that it would offend Jewish students. But at the same time, I was like, we're living through so much anti-Semitism every day. This isn't this isn't new, but it is like important that students have to engage with this, because when you write out the story of the Jewish experience throughout history, it makes people again like desensitized to what's happening right now. And it's easy to, I guess, like that one club president said the Holocaust wasn't that special, or anti-Semitism isn't that special. And yeah, it's really easy to say that when you know nothing about anti-Semitism. And I'm not trying to say that it's worse than any other prejudice at all. I think they're all bad, and I think we should be able to say that was bad. But I think trying to erase or take out Jewish history and the Jewish experience is really detrimental to understanding where we are today.
Well,
Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah, it's a powerful story. And yeah, just, as we've gone through the last few years of different movements, trying to understand different groups, like one thing I've learned is like, I don't know what it's like to be pulled over, and nervous because of the color of my skin. Like, I don't know what that's like. And
Yeah.
I can't tell you not to be nervous, because like, I won't be nervous getting pulled over. Like, I don't know what it's like. And I think it's important to realize, like, I can't say it's not that bad if I'm not experiencing that, if I don't know what it's like.
Yeah.
Well,
Like speak with a professor about it.
oh, wow.
I'm curious, was there ever like any inclination of how this all exploded? Like, where did it come from? Was it talked about? Was it well known outside the Jewish communities? Like, how did this whole thing just
Like the mask
suddenly
came
explode?
off, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like with friends, with in class, maybe getting worse, or like, and how does it happen?
In my personal opinion, I think that it's because there is this like culture of like, it's like very binary culture of you're either right or wrong, moral, immoral. There is no nuance, there is no discussion, there is no debate. So like, it's from the beginning was like, if you support Israel, you support genocide. We even had is it Elon Omar come and describe students who are pro-Israel as pro-genocide.
The senator, congresswoman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And I think there was like this culture of you're either pro-genocide or anti-genocide, and it's like, who is pro-genocide? That's not a thing. But then it's equated to Zionist. You're pro-genocide, anti-Zionist, you're anti-genocide. If you're have any empathy for Jews and Israelis, you're a white supremacist. You don't care about human life. You're on the wrong side of history. You are immoral, and no one wants to be immoral. I think there is a good chunk of people who are just trying their best to support what they think is social justice, what they think is human rights. And especially with Instagram, where you can post anything, you could spread misinformation really quickly, you can simplify something. It's like that all leads to people like taking a stance on something that they don't really know about, or maybe taking a stance because they're scared of not taking a stance. And again, like, it did affect social belonging. I think people want to belong in spaces. They want to feel a part of something. So if the cost is, okay, if in order for you to belong, you have to think and say what I think and what I say, I think people will do that, because when you're 20 and you want to have community, it doesn't seem that bad. Like, it doesn't seem like what you're doing is like some awful thing, or helping perpetuate anti-Semitism, or isolating Jewish students.
Well, Powerful stuff, and yeah, I think a brilliant insight into how it works. My last question that I'm wondering if you have any other final questions either. I'm sure you have a lot, and we can do maybe part twos or whatever. But my last question: was there any point like in the spring where it just felt like it got out of hand and got much worse? And how did that happen?
How did it get so bad? I also want to say during the spring semester, I feel like Jewish students found their joy again. Like when you were able to go home and see your family, you had the space to mourn, you were validated, you were humanized again. We came back and we were like, we deserve to have joy. And we are going to fight to be in these spaces. We're going to be proud of who we are and we're going to be joyful. And that was amazing. It felt like we turned a corner of like, we're together. We've kind of established this network, and we, of course, it was never like life was normal. You would think about the hostages every single day. Like you would see posters, people would rip posters down, we put them back up, like every single day. But we were like, you can't break our spirit. And then the encampment came, and we were like, great, okay. You might be really close to breaking our spirit. The first day, I remember it was also when there was the congressional hearing about anti-Semitism that President Shafiq was at. The night before was actually a huge campus party on that very same lawn. And then security kicked everyone off. And then at 4 a.m., the encampment was there. We had students like sending in group chats like this encampment. And it was one of those things like, I don't even know what to expect. I don't know what this is going to look like. And I think it was hard. It was hard. It's like right in the middle of campus. And, you just have an emotional response. I'd also say watching our classmates get arrested wasn't a good feeling. All of it felt bad. It felt bad, like not feeling like you could go on campus, go to classes, feel. A lot of people would say there's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and unsafe. I would say at first it was uncomfortable, but I didn't feel unsafe. And then they got arrested, and then a new encampment popped up, and then I felt unsafe. This is when you had people saying Zionists are not welcome here. You also had rules put in place of people weren't allowed to talk to Zionists. You weren't allowed to talk to people who weren't in the encampment. So if you wanted to have a conversation of what do you think Intifada is? Like, what does that mean to you? And do you understand how that makes Jewish students feel unsafe? Do you understand how, by any means necessary, feels scary and feels unsafe as proud Jews, proud Zionists on campus? You didn't get to have those conversations. And it was weird. It was a super weird experience of like, Columbia is a hub of intellectual engagement, and that's all facilitated through dialogue. And then you have this system of you're not allowed to talk. You're not allowed to have those engagements. And you had who felt empowered to just say and act however they wanted. There was it felt like there was little respect before, but then it just really deteriorated with the encampment. And that was extremely, extremely difficult. And then I remember when they overtook Hamilton Hall. I was with a group of my friends. We had just gone to a formal, again, like trying to still find joy and find belonging in spaces. And we had this wonderful night, and we came back up to campus, and our friend was texting us like, they're breaking into Hamilton.
What is Hamilton for those of us who don't?
So it's an academic building, and it has a history of student protests. And I think there was like a time when there was like an pro-Palestine protest where they surrounded the library and they kicked the door and they broke the door. Students had to leave through the side exits. And so when our friends started texting us, they're taking Hamilton Hall, we thought it was like the same thing. Like they kicked and broke a door. We walk onto campus and we see chairs, tables on the roofs, people on the roof, signs hanging out, people surrounding the building. And I was horrified. It was like such fear. And I remember I called my family. It was super late. I think in New York it was like 3 a.m. My called my sister and I was like, I can't believe that this is my school right now. And again, it was like one of those experiences where I couldn't articulate what I was thinking. It was such an emotional response of when you see like a place that you love, a place that you felt like so much belonging, like just destroyed, chairs being thrown out, tables flipped over, and like students just fighting, screaming. It was hard to comprehend, and I think that was the turning point for me of like, I don't want to be here anymore. The next day, I had two Jewish friends. We left. We went to Connecticut. We were like, we can't be here because it is so violent and beyond control. And I think a lot of people saw it as like, this is resistance. This is amazing. This is like the epitome of activism. But at the same time, like there was just such an emotional response of who do I go to school with and what what would they do to me? Like what? And again, and like maybe some of it wasn't rational. It was such an emotional experience, but I mean, it was bad enough that we were all like, we need to leave the state. And the reason why I feel like it wasn't just about peace and protesting for Palestinians is because there were several agreements for the encampment of we'll disclose our direct investments, we'll invest in, I think it was healthcare and education in Gaza. And they said no. They said, we don't want the dual degree program at Tel Aviv University. We don't want the Global Center. And it was like, okay, so it feels like your hatred for Israelis, for Zionists, is stronger than your desire to help Palestinians, to advocate for peace. And then to watch this like unfold in front of your eyes, like all those pieces come together and you're just like, what is going on here? Like how will we ever restore community, belonging? And then after that was the huge like they closed campus for multiple blocks and brought police on to clear the building. Turns out there were a lot of people who weren't even affiliated with the university. And then you had a lot of young students, which again, I feel like it's hard to not feel, I guess, sympathy for students who are trying to find belonging and advocate for something that they think is so morally righteous. This is like the first time they're like getting involved or like, this being involved in activism in, you have a global stage. Like I have a lot of sympathy for those students who like, you have to wonder 10 years from now, will you feel differently? Or, how like freshman students are. I mean, I'm not saying that they're mindless. They're very brilliant. They got into Columbia, of course, but I remember being a freshman, really wanting community, being influenced by people. And then you have all these adults, like they're not, like these adults who have a very specific interest. They came here for a specific cause and they promote violence and they're recruiting students to help them with that. And
one more question. Coming from this environment and being there for so many months, and now you're graduated. You're done. You're back in Colorado. Mm-hmm. You're in the next stage of your life. How do you do that?
Yeah, I'm figuring it out. I realize having space from Colombia, just how hard it is to unlearn that fear of it is so hard for me to meet someone and not have this fear of if they know I'm a Zionist, that like I'm no longer human. Like there's no need to get to know me, or I'm not gonna be welcome in this space. And that could be like anything. But it's also like you don't want to define your Judaism by anti Semitism. You don't want like, and so it is a process of like unlearning, relearning, finding, I guess, like navigating your values and being proud to be Jewish, and also being able to build meaningful and fulfilling relationships with the broader community. And yeah, it's been challenging, but I feel like in Colorado, a lot easier. People are just so kind here and willing to just hear you out.
I hope that continues to be your experience,
Yeah.
and welcome to the Colorado Jewish community. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
And looking forward to being together more.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and hearing my story.
Thank you so much. So powerful and inspiring. And I see these things and I see them on social media, and to hear firsthand what it's really like is very powerful. So thank you for taking the time. And thank you all for joining us today and listening. And please do go ahead and subscribe, share with your friends.
Rate, review.
And we appreciate you being with us. Have a beautiful rest of your day and a great week.